The coffee stain spread across Laura Bennett's scrubs like a map of territory she'd already conquered, and Dr. Richard Ashford noticed it the moment she pushed through the ER doors at 0547. He didn't see the way her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd sutured wounds in darkness, guided only by the sound of incoming fire. He didn't see the faded 10th Special Forces Group patch sewn into the jacket lining she'd folded into her locker 17 seconds earlier, hidden beneath a Philadelphia Eagles hoodie that didn't belong to anyone named Laura. He saw a nurse with sloppy time management and questioned priorities. He saw someone he could manage. Sacred Heart's emergency department breathed at this hour like a thing still waking up. Fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song overhead, casting everything in the color of old bone. The smell of antiseptic mixed with burnt coffee from the station pot and something underneath, that copper iron smell of medicine that never quite washed out of the walls, even after night shift. Laura moved through the space like she'd memorized its skeletal structure years ago, which she had. 60-hour shifts. 37 ER days this month. Her body kept time in vitals and monitor beeps the way other people kept time in heartbeats. She pulled Trauma Bay 4's crash cart inventory without checking the clipboard. 2 18-gauge needles. 1 20-gauge. The 14-gauge was missing again. She made a note. The thing about being invisible was that people assumed you weren't paying attention. They assumed you didn't track what went missing, who took it, why the anesthesia inventory never balanced, and which residents were practicing intubations on the mannequin that should have been documented. Laura tracked everything. That was the problem. The locker room was empty except for Margaret from night shift, who was pulling her coat on with the kind of exhaustion that made her shoulders slope forward like a question mark. Margaret didn't look at Laura. Nobody looked at Laura anymore. That was part of the deal. When you disappear from every database, every record, every official history, you get good at disappearing from rooms too. Laura changed from yesterday's scrubs into clean ones, the fabric cold against her skin. She unwrapped the jacket she'd worn since Sangin and hung it carefully on hook 7. Her fingers found the patch inside the lining, 10th Special Forces Group, faded olive drab on black cloth, stitched in by someone who wasn't supposed to be sewing anything but who'd done it anyway at FOB Shank, someone who'd told her to keep it as a reminder that some things couldn't be erased, even if the Pentagon tried. Her thumb traced the stitching. For years since she'd worn that rank. For years of scrubs instead of dress uniform. For years of being Major Bennett in a digital ghost file somewhere, the case file marked classified, the court-martial sealed, the Silver Star recommendation locked in a vault that officially didn't exist. She let her hand drop and closed the locker. Dr. Richard Ashford was waiting at the nurse's station when she emerged at 0600. He was a man built from the same materials as his reputation, expensive watch, shoes polished like a mirror, the kind of haircut that cost $70 and looked like it cost nothing. His presence made the air pressure change, the way certain apex predators did when they entered a space. He had the face of someone who'd never been told no, which meant he'd never understood the word. His eyes were the color of winter sky reflected off concrete, and they tracked her approach with the casual interest of a hawk watching grass move. Rough night? His voice carried the texture of a suggestion that could become an order. Laura set her bag in the cubby below the schedule board. No, Dr. Ashford. Your scrubs suggest otherwise. He smiled without opening his mouth, just a compression of his lips that meant something had amused him privately. Coffee incident. End of shift coffee. Not my best moment. They never are with your employment history, are they? He said it conversationally, the way someone might comment on the weather. The way you might mention that a building was showing cracks before suggesting it needed demolition. Those gaps in your resume. Pretty significant. 18 months, 20 months, then 3 years with no explanation. Makes a person curious. Laura pulled the patient roster from the printer. The paper was still warm from the toner. I moved around. Inconsistent references too. Hard to verify the ones you do provide. Unusual for nursing. He was watching her now with the intensity of someone studying a problem he hadn't solved yet. Sacred Heart is particular about its standards. Board reviews every 6 months. Background reviews every 2. We run tight ships here, Bennett. Tight ships. I understand. Do you? The question landed softly, but it landed. His phone buzzed and he glanced at it, his expression shifting into something more predatory. Anyway. Not my department. Just making conversation. Orientation is at 0630 with the new residents. Try not to embarrass yourself during patient handoff. Last week you explained a sepsis protocol to Dr. Chen like he was a first-year intern. He noticed. He walked away before she could respond, which was the point. The kind of man who needed the last word was the kind of man who made sure he always had it. Laura watched him disappear into his office, a real office, with a door and a window that looked out at the city instead of at the trauma bays, and she felt the familiar compression in her chest, the same feeling she'd learned to recognize in Sangin as the moment right before everything went wrong. The emergency department at 0630 was still quiet. The morning shift wouldn't reach full volume until 0900, when the walk-ins started arriving with their ailments and their insurance cards and their stories about how they'd been meaning to get this checked out for weeks. Right now the place had the quality of a stage set before the actors took their places. 3 occupied bays. 1 waiting room patient. The monitor sounds like distant rainfall. Laura worked the triage station, checking inventory, restocking the crash cart that had been left incomplete, running her hands across equipment with the kind of tactile awareness that came from having assembled it in the dark. 17 years of medicine. 4 of them in country. Everything else wrapped in a silence so thick you could operate in it. The trauma pager sat silent on the desk. She was checking the defibrillator leads when someone dropped a stack of charts on the counter hard enough to make them scatter. One of the residents, Lopez, 3rd year, the kind of young doctor who'd been handed everything his entire life and was just beginning to understand that the world had no particular interest in his credentials. He looked at her like she was part of the furniture, and when he spoke, he was already looking away. Triage for Bay 2. 47-year-old male, chest pain, sent over from the Veteran Center. ETA 3 minutes. Laura nodded. She was already reaching for the chart. They said he passed out briefly, Lopez continued, his voice carrying the cadence of someone reading from a text he wasn't really processing. Came to right away. Vitals were stable when they loaded him. Probably nothing, but protocol says we run the full workup. Copy that. He left without confirming she'd understood. That was fine. Laura had understood the moment he said passed out and Veteran Center because her body understood things her brain wasn't permitted to acknowledge. Passed out meant possible cardiac event. Veteran Center meant someone with a story, someone with a past, someone possibly like her. The monitor beep seemed louder suddenly. The fluorescent light seemed brighter. The ER doors were going to open in less than 2 minutes. The morning was about to start. And somewhere in the city, someone from Laura Bennett's former life was being transported toward her at 70 miles per hour without knowing it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she recognized him the moment they wheeled him through the doors, and she couldn't let anyone see that she did. A man with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd carried weight for 40 years, whose face had been printed on the wall of the 10th Special Forces Group headquarters the last time she was allowed to know what or where that was. Colonel Marcus Reeves, commander of her court-martial. The man who'd sat in that classified room with his folder closed in front of him and his expression professionally neutral while lawyers older than nations explained why her discharge was necessary, why her record was being redacted, why speaking about her service was something that could result in federal prosecution. The man who'd written something in that folder that she'd never been allowed to read, but that had ended her career anyway. And he was pale. His breathing was shallow. His jaw was clenched in a way that suggested pain. Dr. Ashford emerged from his office like a predator that had caught a scent on the wind. He moved toward the incoming stretcher with the confidence of someone who owned the space, his hands already reaching, his voice already authoritative and loud enough that everyone in the ER turned to watch. His white coat billowed behind him like a cape. His presence had that quality of absolute certainty that came from never having been wrong, or if he had been wrong, from never having been forced to acknowledge it. Let's get him to the trauma bay. Full cardiac workup. I'll take this one personally. Laura set down the chart. Her hands didn't tremble. They never trembled anymore. Trembling was a luxury for people who had the option of fear. Her hands were connected to a memory that existed in classified files, in redacted documents, in a conversation with military lawyers who'd explained that speaking about her experience was not just against the law, it was a matter of national security. So she watched Dr. Ashford take over. She watched him issue orders that the nurses followed without question. She watched him place himself between the patient and the competent people in the room, which was where he always placed himself, which was how she knew that whatever happened next was going to change the shape of the morning in ways that nobody could predict except the people who'd already lived versions of this scene in different countries, in different uniforms, in rooms that didn't exist on any map. The stretcher burst through Sacred Heart's automatic doors at 0847, pushed by 3 VFW escorts still wearing their dress blues from the fundraiser breakfast, their voices overlapping in controlled panic. Colonel Marcus Reeves lay on his back, chest heaving in shallow gasps, his lips the color of a winter sky. The oxygen mask fogged and cleared. His right hand gripped the stretcher rail so hard his knuckles had turned white as bone. Laura was running a urinalysis on a drunk driver when she heard the overhead, incoming trauma, ER Bay 1, priority. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The way the nurses moved, that specific urgency reserved for people with authority, told her it was important. Then she heard his voice through the chaos, even through the pain, even through the gasping, "Get me someone who knows what they're doing." The accent was different now, flattened by age and 3 combat tours, but the cadence was identical to 7 years ago. To the Article 32 hearing. To the moment he'd read the predetermined verdict with that expression of performative regret that made it worse than if he'd simply been cruel. She set down the urinalysis cup. Dr. Ashford was already moving, his white coat flaring like a cape as he intercepted the stretcher before the residents could reach him. "Bay 1, he commanded, the kind of voice that made nurses scatter. Laura watched him place one hand on the colonel's shoulder, a gesture that probably felt protective but looked proprietary, and she saw Reeves's eyes close briefly, recognition or relief, she couldn't tell. She should have stayed at the lab station. That was the correct tactical choice. That was the decision that kept her invisible, kept her employed, kept the faded 10th Special Forces group patch hidden inside her jacket lining safe from anyone who might ask questions about the gaps in her employment history. She was at Bay 1 in 17 seconds anyway. The colonel lay bare-chested now, his ribcage expanding and collapsing like something desperate and trapped. His skin had taken on the grey pallor she'd seen before, in field hospitals in Helmand Province, in soldiers who'd lost more than they could afford to lose. The heart monitor climbed, 105, 110, 120. His right side moved differently than his left, that asymmetrical chest wall expansion, the telltale sign of a pneumothorax building pressure against his heart. Ashford was ordering films. X-rays. Chest CT protocols that would take 15 minutes they didn't have. Laura moved to the colonel's left side and placed one hand on his sternum. "Colonel," she said quietly. "Look at me." His eyes found hers and something in his face shifted, a flicker of recognition that lasted approximately 1/3 of a second before his oxygen-starved brain released it. "You're having trouble breathing because your lung has collapsed. I'm going to help you. I need you to focus on my voice, not on the oxygen, not on the pain. Can you do that?" He nodded once. She was already reaching for the equipment tray with her other hand, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in convoy trucks and combat outposts under fire. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol swab. The second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she'd located it by feel 1,000 times. She didn't need to think about it. Her hands moved. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping, that specific, unmistakable sound of pressure releasing from a space it shouldn't occupy. The colonel's body relaxed visibly, his shoulders dropping, his breathing evening out from panic gasps to shallow but functional breaths. 1 second. 2 seconds of stabilization. Then Ashford was there, displacing her with his body the way he always did, his hands reaching for the equipment she'd just used. "Good call on the basics," he said, loud enough for the residents and nurses to hear. "Let's get him intubated and stabilized properly." Laura stepped back. That was the moment to disappear. That was the moment to walk out of the bay and return to the lab station, to the urinalysis cup, to the safe invisibility of someone who didn't ask questions. Ashford's hand was already reaching for the overhead paging system. "Nurse Nightingale," the speakers crackled, his voice smooth as silk through the intercom. "Nurse Nightingale to curtain 4. Nurse Nightingale to curtain 4. The entire ER floor stilled. 13 nurses at various stations. For residents. 2 attending physicians. A janitor in the corner. All of them heard it. All of them knew he was referring to Laura, to the nickname he'd started using 3 weeks ago after she'd questioned his dosing on a cardiac case, a dosing that would have been lethal if she hadn't double-checked it. The room went dead silent. Laura's jaw tightened. That was all. One muscle contraction. She walked past the stretcher without looking at the colonel, without acknowledging the paging system, without giving Ashford the satisfaction of watching her react. A resident smirked. A nurse looked away. She kept walking. By the time she reached the supply closet at 0912, she'd already decided she wasn't going to cry about it. The decision had been made somewhere between the ER bay and the medication refrigerator, somewhere in the part of her that had learned in Sangin that tears were a luxury for people with different lives. She was reaching for the saline flushes when Ashford's shadow appeared in the doorway, blocking the light, blocking the exit. "Your employment history is concerning, Bennett," he said quietly. His voice had that tank-idling quality, powerful and controlled and dangerous because of the control. "I've reviewed your file. 3 hospitals in 5 years. 2-month gaps between positions. No references from your previous employers. That raises questions." Laura didn't turn around. She kept her hands on the saline bottles, kept her breathing steady, kept every muscle below her jaw from moving. "I know what happened at Philadelphia Medical," he continued, stepping inside the closet and closing the door behind him. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed. "A compliance issue. Something about a medication administration incident. I know because I made some phone calls. I know because people talk." He was lying. Philadelphia Medical had no record of her because she'd never worked there. He was fishing. Testing. Trying to find a weakness to exploit. "You hesitated," he said, and now she could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the certainty that he'd found the thread that would unravel her. "When the colonel came in, you hesitated. I saw it. 1 second of paralysis before you moved. That's not how trained nurses work, Bennett. That's how people who are hiding something work." Laura turned around slowly. The closet was maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. Ashford was standing with his back to the door, his hands at his sides, his expression the measured confidence of a man who'd never been afraid of anyone smaller than himself, anyone without a title above his on the organizational chart. "You have gaps in your resume that you can't explain," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You have no professional references. You ask questions about my clinical decisions despite being far below the level of expertise required to do so. And this morning, you showed a reaction to a patient that suggested personal connection rather than professional detachment." He took 1 step closer. "I have reviewed your work for 3 weeks, and I've documented every inconsistency, every deviation, every moment of questionable judgment. I can walk you out of this hospital in front of everyone you work with, and there isn't a single thing you can say that would prevent it. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop questioning my decisions. You're going to stop disrupting my department. And you're going to do your job with your mouth closed and your head down. Because if you don't, if you give me one more reason, I will have security walking you out before your next shift. Do we understand each other?" Laura took 1 measured breath. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch or retreat or show him the panic that was starting to vibrate in her chest like a second heartbeat, because showing him panic was the same as handing him the weapon. She reached up slowly and wiped away the single tear that had escaped from her right eye, not because she couldn't stop it, but because she wanted him to see her wipe it away without breaking eye contact, wanted him to understand that even her own tears wouldn't grant him the satisfaction of her submission. "Colonel Reeves is still your patient, Dr. Ashford," she said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave, and she watched his face register the shift. "I hope your ego is enough to keep him breathing." For approximately 1 second, he didn't move. Then he stepped back, turned toward the door, and pulled it open. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights rushed back in. The sounds of the emergency department, monitors beeping, nurses calling updates, phones ringing, filled the space he'd occupied. "Reassignment effective immediately," he said without turning around. "Intake triage. Parking lot handoff zone. You'll take vitals on incoming transfers and document them in the system. That's your job now, Bennett. And if I hear one complaint, if I find one discrepancy, you're done." He walked out without waiting for a response. Laura sat on an empty supply box for exactly 14 seconds. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She didn't allow her hands to open and close in frustration the way she wanted them to. Instead, she counted her breathing, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, the same rhythm she'd used in convoy trucks headed toward villages that might contain IEDs, the same rhythm that had kept her alive when everything else was falling apart. At 13:40, Dr. Ashford announced the reassignment over the hospital radio during shift change, his voice carrying that edge of satisfaction that comes from public punishment. "Bennett, you're reassigned to intake triage in the parking lot handoff effective immediately." Laura was standing at the nurses' station in yesterday's coffee-stained scrubs when the message came through. 3 nurses exchanged glances. A resident turned away. Nobody met her eyes as she moved toward the elevator. The parking lot was cold. Philadelphia in November smelled like diesel exhaust and rain preparing to fall, like the city was holding its breath before something changed. She stood in the covered handoff zone, clipboard in one hand, pulse oximeter in the other, watching ambulances arrive and transfer patients to the ER team. Vitals. Documentation. The bottom rung of hospital hierarchy. The kind of work that nobody paid attention to unless something went wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, the shift change arrived at Sacred Heart like a changing of the guard, and Dr. Richard Ashford waited for the moment when the most witnesses would be standing in the parking lot. He found Laura taking vitals on an incoming transfer, a 68-year-old with pneumonia and a weak pulse, nothing urgent, nothing that required her attention beyond the clipboard in her hands. The November air bit had exposed skin, and rain had started that morning, leaving the asphalt slick and dark. Ashford stood on the concrete apron between the ambulance bay and the ER doors, waiting until the arriving day shift clustered nearby with their badges clipped to fresh scrubs, until their eyes were on him, until Laura couldn't pretend she didn't see what was about to happen. He raised his voice, the kind of raised voice that carried authority without shouting, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. "Bennett. New assignment, effective immediately." His eye swept across the gathering nurses, Rodriguez, Chen, Paulson, the ones who had been in curtain for when Laura moved past him like he wasn't there, like she was operating under orders from someone whose rank outweighed his title. "You're assigned to intake triage. Parking lot handoff. Full-time rotation, starting now." He paused, letting the word settle. "You're too valuable for the floor work. Better suited to your actual skill level." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when everyone understands the knife has been drawn, even if most of them don't comprehend what made it necessary to draw it. Paulson, who had been standing 3 feet from Ashford when Laura decompressed Reeves's chest with nothing but her hands and a voice that sounded like it had commanded soldiers, looked away. Rodriguez studied her shoes. Chen held her badge like a lifeline. Laura stood in yesterday's scrubs, the coffee stain still visible on the right cuff, brown dried against green cotton, and took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from somewhere deep, from a place that had been trained to be still before the first shot fired, to be silent before the first scream. She didn't defend herself. She didn't argue. She did something far worse. She let a single tear escape from her left eye, and then she wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Ashford, the motion deliberate and controlled, the kind of movement that is watched and remembered. And then she said, quietly enough that only Ashford heard it, though her voice somehow carried to everyone standing there, "Colonel Reeves is still your patient, Dr. Ashford. I hope your ego is enough to keep him breathing." The silence stretched. Ashford's jaw tightened, a muscle working at the hinge, and his hands curled against his thighs. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected submission, or anger, or tears, or some display of the emotional breakdown that would justify everything he was about to do. What he got instead was a single sentence from a woman in coffee-stained scrubs that made every person within earshot understand that she had just given him permission to destroy her, had just handed him the reason he needed, had just ensured that he would spend every remaining minute of his shift making sure she understood the cost of defiance. "Get out of the ER," he said, his voice dropping, and it wasn't a request. It was a command. "Parking lot. And if I hear one more word from you about my clinical decisions, you won't need security. You'll just be gone." Laura picked up the clipboard from the transfer stretcher and walked toward the parking lot intake station, a small prefabricated structure set back from the main ambulance bay where paramedics handed off patients who didn't require immediate emergency treatment. The kind of station nobody visited unless they had to. The kind of assignment that meant she was functionally erased from the hospital's main operation, relegated to the boundary between the ambulance bay and the street, where she could be seen from the windows but not heard, where she could process triage paperwork and vital signs but never touch anything that mattered. The cold November air wrapped around her as she walked, and the rain had picked up, coming sideways now, the kind of rain that feels personal. She set up in the station, a stainless steel desk, a blood pressure cuff, a pulse oximeter, the basic tools of assessment without the authority to act on what the assessment revealed. Around her, the city continued. Ambulances came and went. Paramedics called out patient information in the efficient shorthand of people who had learned to communicate without feeling. Somewhere above, in the trauma bays and critical care units, Colonel Marcus Reeves lay in a hospital bed monitored by machines that Ashford was now free to operate without her presence contradicting him. She was still within sight of Sacred Heart, but she had been removed from it in every way that mattered. The isolation was strategic and surgical, and it was only the beginning. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, while Laura was processing her 5th intake and the rain had settled into a consistent drizzle, Ashford had already made the first of his calls. Rodriguez, the one who had stood closest when Laura performed the technique that Ashford didn't understand and therefore couldn't acknowledge, was transferred to the night shift at Memorial General, a different hospital across the city, starting the following week. Chen, who had nodded when Laura's voice dropped into that cadence, was reassigned to the psychiatric ward, a floor so understaffed that she would be too overwhelmed to speak to anyone about what she'd seen. Paulson was moved to the pediatric emergency department, different protocols, different patients, different staff, effective immediately, no discussion, no appeal. The schedule changes followed. The rotation that would have placed Laura back on the critical care floor in 3 days was rewritten. The ICU access badge that hung from her ID would no longer grant her entry to the levels where Colonel Reeves lay, where complex cases required experienced nurses, where her presence might somehow suggest that Ashford's competence was in question. By 5 o'clock, the security system had been updated. Her badge would open doors to the parking lot station, the employee lounge, the public restrooms, and nowhere else. What made it brilliant, what made it the work of a man who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy, was that none of it was technically insubordination. None of it was the kind of overt retaliation that could be complained about, that could be pointed to as proof of something. Rodriguez's transfer was due to the staffing needs at Memorial. Chen's assignment to psychiatry was a rotation request that became available. Paulson's move to pediatrics was a departmental balance. The security badge update was routine maintenance. The schedule adjustment was based on patient volume forecasting. It was the work of a man who knew that the most effective destruction happened quietly, in the spaces between official statements, where nothing could ever be pointed to as definitive proof of cruelty. Laura could walk into administration and say that Ashford had punished her for saving a patient, and he could produce 7 different documentation justifications, each one reasonable, each one defensible, each one true enough to be believed by people who didn't understand that the real truth lived in the spaces between those justifications. By 6:30, as Laura sat in the parking lot intake station and watched the rain fall harder, condensation fogging the small window beside her, Ashford had filed the formal complaint. It was precise, measured, and utterly damning. Protocol violations during emergency treatment. Practicing outside her scope as a registered nurse. Unauthorized use of medical equipment. Verbal insubordination. A pattern of behavior that suggested instability, poor judgment, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the chain of command. Every charge was constructed from a detail that was technically true, twisted just far enough that it became something else entirely. The complaint was addressed to the hospital's chief of staff, copied to human resources, flagged as urgent. The thing about strategic retaliation is that it doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to threaten. It just needs to work, methodically and relentlessly, until the person being destroyed has no allies, no access, no place to stand that isn't already saturated with evidence of their own incompetence. By the time Laura's shift ended and she walked to her car in the employee lot, the machinery was already turning. The next morning would bring the phone call from administration. The suspension would be presented as routine, pending investigation, standard procedure, nothing personal. The fact that Colonel Reeves was still her patient would be irrelevant. The fact that she had saved his life would be overshadowed by a formal complaint suggesting that she had done so recklessly, dangerously, without authority or justification. Ashford stood in the ER at 7 o'clock that evening, watching the monitors display the vital signs of patients he now had full authority over, and he allowed himself a single moment of satisfaction. The trembling that moved through his chest wasn't doubt. It was something else entirely. It was the feeling of control returning, of order being restored, of the natural hierarchy reasserting itself. But that wasn't the worst part. The monitors were screaming. 3 sharp alarms cutting through the ICU like warning flares, and Laura heard the chaos before she saw it, the sound of a code in progress, oxygen masks, the wet hollow gasp of a man suffocating from the inside. She pushed through the ICU doors at 16:15 exactly, ignoring the security guard shout behind her, boots finding tile in a rhythm that hadn't changed since Sangin. Cubicle 4. Colonel Reeves lay grey as January, his chest heaving against the ventilator, his skin the color of old wax. The monitors screamed, O2 sat dropping, 72, 68, 65. Blood pressure cratering. Heart rate climbing past 140. Dr. Ashford stood at the bedside barking orders like a man still convinced his voice could stop the bleeding. Increase FiO2 to 100%. Get me another unit of blood. Someone contact cardiology. His hands moved through the motions of a doctor who had never watched a man die of his own mistakes. 2 residents flanked him, paralyzed, waiting for instructions they both sensed were wrong. Laura's eyes caught the chest tube running from Reeves's lung to the drainage chamber. The line had twisted. Kinked. A blockage creating pressure that had nowhere to go, tension building in the pleural space like a bomb with a ticking timer. The bag wasn't bubbling. No air escaping. The kind of complication that killed men in minutes, the kind of complication that field hospitals had taught her to see the way other people saw color. She didn't call out. She didn't ask permission. She shouldered past the first resident with the kind of motion that made him step backward without thinking, her hands already moving toward the supplies before her brain caught up, 14-gauge needle, alcohol swab, the exact spot between the second and third ribs where the needle would go. Ashford's voice cut across the room. Bennett, step back, that's outside your, but she was already there, her left hand finding the intercostal space with the certainty of someone who had done this in darkness, in rain, in the screaming chaos of a field hospital in Helmand province. The needle went in. The hiss of air. One sharp exhalation of pressure as the tension broke and the lung could expand again. The monitors changed their song. O2 sat climbing, 68, 75, 82, 90. The heart rate dropping from 144 to 120 to 108. Reeves's color shifting from wax gray to something approximating living flesh. "Stay with me, Colonel," she said, her voice the same register she'd used for wounded Marines whose names she no longer had permission to remember. "Your lung re-inflated. You're breathing. Stay with me." Her hand rested on his shoulder, steady as a surgical laser, and something in her presence, the absence of panic, the presence of absolute certainty, seemed to pull him back from whatever edge he'd been approaching. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed into the mattress. She turned to the residents. "Watch that tube. Any kinking, notify me immediately." Ashford stood motionless. His mouth was open slightly. His eyes had narrowed to points of light that were not quite rage and not quite fear, but something in the space between, the moment when a man realizes he's lost control of his own operating room. What happened next happened quietly. That was the terrifying part. Ashford didn't shout. He didn't throw instruments or demand her credentials. He nodded once, a movement so subtle it almost wasn't there, and then he stepped into the hallway and made phone calls. 3 of them, she would learn later. 1 to human resources. 1 to the hospital administrator. 1 to a lawyer he kept on retainer for exactly these moments. His retaliation was surgical and immediate in the way that truly dangerous people operate, not loud, not visible, but comprehensive. By 1630, she was being pulled from the ICU rotation. By 1700, the nurses who had witnessed her save Reeves's life were being reassigned to evening shifts in different wings. By 1730, her badge access had been restricted to the ground floor intake area and the locker room. The system had been designed by someone who understood that the most efficient way to destroy someone was not to attack them directly, but to isolate them, document every moment of their isolation, and then present the documentation as evidence of incompetence. Ashford filed the complaint at 1740. Protocol violations. Unauthorized treatment intervention. Practicing beyond her nursing scope. Insubordination. The employment gaps that had always made administrators uneasy suddenly became the centerpiece of a narrative about credibility and trustworthiness. 1 page of carefully documented moments where she'd hesitated, where she'd spoken to doctors in ways that suggested she might have opinions, where her competence had apparently exceeded her station. The kind of file that took weeks to build. The kind of file that makes administrators sit up straighter in their chairs. At 1745, she was sitting in an office on the 3rd floor with pale walls and a woman from Human Resources whose name she hadn't retained. The HR director, Margaret something, Margaret with the sad eyes that suggested she'd done this many times before, slid a folder across the desk. Inside was Ashford's complaint, each charge typed in the calm language of institutional power. The administrator sat in the corner chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "We take these allegations very seriously," Margaret said. Her voice was the kind of voice that had probably said this exact phrase 300 times. A nurse intervening in treatment decisions is serious. Especially without physician authorization. Especially when we have documentation suggesting a pattern of employment instability. Laura read the pages without speaking. Each one was a distortion so precise it was almost true. The hesitation with Reeves had become neglect. The moment she'd questioned Ashford's orders had become insubordination. The 18-month gap in her employment 7 years ago, the gap that was actually classified military service, had become an unexplained absence that raised credibility concerns. "We're suspending your clinical privileges pending a full investigation," Margaret continued. "This suspension takes effect immediately. You'll be contacted when we're ready to proceed with the hearing." Laura signed the papers. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. The truth was locked behind a security clearance. The truth was classified. The truth was that she had saved Reeves's life using a technique that didn't exist in the civilian medical literature, had never been taught in any hospital nursing program, had come from watching men die in the field and learning to predict what the body needed before the monitors could tell you. She walked through the emergency department at 18:15, moving through the corridors like a ghost passing through a room of the living. Her locker was in the staff break room. Inside, the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the one thing she'd kept from her other life. A photograph of her team, faces down on the metal shelf so nobody could ask questions. Spare scrubs. A protein bar someone had left 3 weeks ago that she'd never eaten. She gathered it all into her bag without looking up, aware of the nurses watching from across the room, aware that they knew what had happened, aware that they couldn't help her and wouldn't try. One resident approached. The young woman named Chen who Laura had taught to suture 2 months ago, who'd stayed late to practice the technique until her hand stopped shaking. "I'm sorry," Chen mouthed, not saying it aloud, knowing that speaking the words would draw Ashford's attention if he was watching. Laura nodded once and walked past. She made it to the parking garage at 18:30, the November cold hitting her face like a slap of clarity. Level 3, Bay 47. Her 2008 Honda Civic with the Virginia license plate she'd bought when she first disappeared into the civilian world. She sat in the driver's seat and closed the door and turned the key off immediately. The garage around her was concrete and echoing emptiness. Distant elevator dings. A car alarm somewhere 3 levels up. Her own breathing, steady and controlled because her body had learned long ago that panic was a luxury for people with options. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her hand still didn't shake. After 8 months of being called just a nurse, after 4 weeks of Ashford's escalating contempt, after one perfect moment of using every skill she'd ever learned to save a man's life, her hand still didn't shake. That was the cruelest part. That her nervous system was so thoroughly trained for crisis that it couldn't panic even now, sitting in a parking garage at the moment her second life had ended exactly like the first one had, with a man in power deciding that the cost of her existence was too high. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She had saved Colonel Reeves yesterday. She had identified the complication Ashford had missed, had used a field hospital technique she shouldn't have known, had done the work of a combat medic in an intensive care unit. And in doing that, she had exposed herself. She had given them the evidence they needed to understand that something was different about her, something that didn't match the employment history, something that suggested she was more than just a nurse. And Ashford, who had ordered her court-martial 7 years ago, who had presided over her erasure, who had documented every moment of her hidden identity, had finally won. She sat there until 2,100 hours, until the cold became something physical enough to require a response. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, steady as stone, while the rest of the world collapsed around her. She had survived combat. She had survived court-martial. She had survived 7 years of invisibility. But she couldn't survive being noticed. That was the pattern she couldn't break. Every time she was good enough, every time she did something that mattered, it was the thing that destroyed her. At 21:05, she started the engine. It caught immediately, the sound of practical machinery in an empty garage. She drove out into the November night toward an apartment in northeast Philadelphia where nobody knew who she used to be, where the walls were thin and the rent was month to month, where she could disappear again if she needed to. She didn't know yet that someone else was already looking for her. She didn't know that the conversation she'd had with Reeves in that ICU was being reported up chains of command that Ashford didn't even know existed. She didn't know that 24 hours from now, the parking garage would be full of people in uniform, and her second life would transform into something neither she nor Ashford could control. The convoy arrived at Sacred Heart's main entrance at precisely 1,047 hours, 3 black Suburbans with tinted windows, government plates, moving with the calculated precision of people who didn't ask permission. Above them, a UH-60M Black Hawk helicopter circled in tight patterns, rotors drumming against the Philadelphia sky like war drums announcing judgment. The morning shift stopped moving. Patients in the waiting room turned toward the windows. Nurses whispered into their phones, calling back to the emergency department. Something was happening. 2 officers in Class A dress uniforms exited the lead vehicle, their ribbons arranged in ascending order of prestige, their shoes polished to mirrors. They walked past the security desk without pausing. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The guard's hand froze above his phone. These were not the kind of people who were stopped at checkpoints. "We're looking for Major Laura Bennett." The first officer's voice carried the weight of authority that made the entire lobby contract. "We need her location immediately. This is official military business." The words hit like ordnance. Major Laura Bennett. The name nobody at Sacred Heart knew because she'd buried it so deep even the filing systems didn't recognize it. The guard's face went blank for a fraction of a second, confusion and recognition colliding, before he reached for the intercom. But before he could speak, Dr. Richard Ashford stepped out of the pharmacy hallway 15 feet away, and his face went white. Pale as a trauma patient in hemorrhagic shock. His jaw went slack. His hand reached for the counter to steady himself because he understood, in that moment, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had destroyed a woman he didn't know existed. The military officers found Laura in the clinical education center reviewing procedural updates she'd assigned herself during her suspension, staying current, staying ready, the habit of training that never stops. When they walked through the door, she didn't stand. She looked at their uniforms, at the insignia on their shoulders, and something in her posture shifted. Not visible to untrained eyes, but there. A recognition. A returning home. Major Bennett. The first officer's voice softened. This was respect. Not protocol. Respect. Colonel Reeves is waiting in the conference room. We need to move. She stood in one fluid motion and followed them without questions, her job-issued ID badge still clipped to her waist like a costume she was finally allowed to shed. The conference room on the executive floor had been converted into something between a military briefing and a civilian reckoning. Colonel Marcus Reeves stood at the head of a mahogany table that suddenly looked very small, his uniform impeccable despite the tremor in his hands that suggested he hadn't slept in days. His chest still carried the faint surgical dressing beneath his uniform. He shouldn't have been mobile yet, but he was here anyway, standing anyway, because some things mattered more than medical protocol. Behind him stood a SEAL team leader whose call sign was Breaker and whose presence made the air pressure change, as if the room itself understood it was now occupied by someone who'd walked through gates most people don't know exist. A military attorney in an impeccably tailored suit held a classified file, the edges still marked with the red declassified stamp and today's date. The room smelled like old paper and new authority. Reeves's hand shook as he opened the file. Captain Laura Bennett, call sign Nightjar. His voice cracked on the third word. Silver Star for courage under fire. Sangin Valley, Helmand Province, 2015. 17 wounded soldiers treated under sustained enemy fire. 18 minutes under direct small arms and machine gun fire while you established a field surgical station using only what was available. He turned the first photograph around so she could see it. Laura in desert camouflage, 13 years younger, her face covered in dust and something darker, her hand steady on a tourniquet. Someone else's blood. Someone she saved. Your final classified operation was authorized directly by JSOC Command, Reeves continued, and now his voice was steady because he'd practiced this so many times it had worn grooves into his discipline. Operation Nightjar's Descent. A recovery mission in Kandahar province that went sideways because your extraction team was compromised from inside. 16 soldiers went into that compound. 14 came out. The other 2 were listed as disavowed. Casualties never recorded. Your unit was dissolved. Every record was sealed and buried. And you, his voice threatened to crack again but held. You were court-martialed as cover. As political protection for an operation that was supposed to stay classified until 2045. The military attorney stepped forward and placed 7 medals on the table in a precise line. Each one a story. Each one a threshold crossed. Bronze Star. The attorney's voice was clinical, official, leaving no room for emotion even though emotion was cracking the walls. Silver Star. A pause. The photograph of her in Sangin now joined the medal, like proof. 2 purple hearts. Ashford's entire institutional world was collapsing, but nobody in this room cared about that. And this one, Major. This is the one we're reinstating today. He placed the final medal down with ceremonial precision. It gleamed under the fluorescent lights like a promise that should have been kept 16 years ago. Navy Cross. For extraordinary heroism under fire while maintaining medical capability for your unit. Reeves's hands were shaking too badly to speak, so Breaker took over. His voice was exactly what military voices sound like when they're describing things civilians shouldn't have to know about. You were court-martialed because your commanding officer was protecting the operation. I was in that compound, Major. I watched you work on Sergeant Rodriguez for 43 minutes while we held a perimeter that was collapsing. You kept him breathing. We got him to Bagram. He lived. He's in Arlington right now running a veterans transition center because you wouldn't let him die. The room held its breath. Laura's face was absolutely still. Not expressionless, composed. The difference between a person hiding and a person who had already made peace with the worst possible truths. I spent 6 years trying to find you after the declassification came through, Reeves said quietly. 6 years. Your trail went cold in Philadelphia. I kept looking. When I had the cardiac event last week, I was scheduled to be in Pittsburgh. But I changed my location last minute. Philadelphia. To keep looking. He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd finally finished a mission that should have ended long ago. And then I walked into Sacred Heart's emergency department with a tension pneumothorax, and you were there. The military attorney opened a second file. This one was about Sacred Heart. About Dr. Richard Ashford. About 6 years of altered patient charts, each one meticulously displayed on the conference room's projection screen like an accusation that couldn't be argued with. Chart falsifications. Medication orders changed. Diagnoses shifted to cover diagnostic failures. Nurses who'd complained and then been reassigned or encouraged to resign. A systemic pattern of competent-looking incompetence that had been quietly settled, case by case, through the hospital's legal department, each settlement carrying an NDA worth $50,000 to $340,000 depending on the severity. When Major Bennett performed the emergency chest decompression on Colonel Reeves, she performed it outside her nursing credentials, the attorney said in that same clinical voice. Which is exactly why she was the only person in that room who recognized what Dr. Ashford had missed. A blast injury complication that required specific combat medical training. 3 separate expert witnesses have confirmed that her intervention saved Colonel Reeves's life. Without it, he would have suffered cardiac arrest within minutes. The projection shifted. It showed a comparison, the standard chest tube placement that Ashford had ordered, and the kinked location where the tube had twisted inside Reeves's chest cavity. The military's best trauma surgeons had reviewed the imaging. The comments were brief and devastating. Missed complication. Protocol violation by ER chief. Civilian protocol insufficient for blast injuries. Dr. Ashford's investigation into Major Bennett's actions triggered a mandatory review of his entire patient record by the Pennsylvania Medical Board, the attorney continued. That review is ongoing. At this moment, his medical license is suspended pending the outcome of that investigation. He will face 4 separate civil malpractice suits totaling approximately $8.7 million in damages. The board is also recommending criminal negligence charges related to 2 patient deaths that occurred under his direct care where similar diagnostic failures occurred. Nobody spoke. The silence was the kind that happens when institutional power collapses into its component parts and suddenly everyone can see how fragile it always was. Laura's voice, when she finally spoke, was like listening to someone switch languages. The deferential softness that had characterized her every word at Sacred Heart was completely gone. The composure remained, but it was composure now from a different source. From someone who'd already been broken and found out she was made of different material than other people. Is Colonel Reeves fully recovered? The question had military precision. Medically specific. Command authority embedded in grammar. 98%, Reeves said. In 2 weeks, I'll be cleared for light duty. 3 months, full duty. You saved my life. Twice, actually. Once in that ICU. Once by not letting the truth die in classified obscurity. Then we're done here, Laura said. What happens to Ashford is the institution's problem now. I'm interested in what happens to the people his negligence might have harmed. The attorney nodded as if she'd passed some test that mattered. The board is prioritizing review of all patients treated in his service line over the last 6 years. There are approximately 473 cases under examination. We'll likely find between 8 and 15 cases where his misdiagnosis had direct impact on patient outcomes. Then that's where I'm going, Laura said. Not back to night shift. Not a parking lot intake. If the board will have me, I want to work with the review team as a subject matter expert on the cases where combat medical principles might have been missed. It wasn't a request. It was a command. And everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd been quietly saving lives in an ER while carrying a silver star as an unclaimed burden was now going to do it openly. With authority. With a weight of military precision backing every decision. 6 months later, at 2,300 hours, Laura Bennett walked past the night security desk at Sacred Heart's employee entrance in professional attire, the kind of clothes that said director, that said authority, that said this woman had nothing left to prove to anyone. The night guard looked up from his desk, and his face registered what he was seeing before he could control it. Dr. Richard Ashford. Stripped of his medical license. Stripped of his position. Working the shift nobody wanted because it was the only hospital job his settlement agreement allowed him to accept. The night security desk at the entrance. 8 hours of every night, 5 nights a week, watching people come and go from a place where he used to hold absolute power. His uniform was the same, the hospital's generic security guard navy blue, but it fit differently on a man who'd lost weight and authority and every institutional prop that had once held him upright. His face was grey. His hands looked smaller. The wedding ring he'd worn for 16 years was gone. Laura didn't slow. Didn't acknowledge him beyond a brief nod, the professional courtesy one might extend to any security officer at a hospital entrance. Nothing more. Nothing less. She moved past him like she was already thinking about the next thing, and the next thing, and the thing after that. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor where the plaque beside the door read Director of Emergency Medicine, Major Laura Bennett, M.D. The hospital's board had fast-tracked her medical degree recognition after the military revelations came through. Her combat medical training and field experience exceeded most civilian emergency medicine residencies. She'd spent the last 6 months in those review meetings with the Pennsylvania Medical Board, examining 473 cases where Ashford's diagnostic failures might have caused harm. She'd found 17. Her office overlooked the ER floor where nurses worked the overnight shift, the same floor where Ashford had paged a Nurse Nightingale over the hospital intercom 7 months ago. The same floor where she'd saved Colonel Reeves's life using techniques the institution had never trained her to use because they'd buried the person who knew them. The faded unit patch from the 10th Special Forces Group hung framed on her office wall now, no longer hidden in a jacket lining but displayed with the pride of a soldier finally allowed to be herself. Beside it, the Silver Star. Beside that, the Navy Cross. And in the center, a photograph from Sangin Valley, her entire Nightjar team, every face, everyone who'd survived and everyone who hadn't. Sergeant Rodriguez, the one Breaker had mentioned, stood in the back row with his arm around someone who might have been his wife. He'd sent her the photo with a note, because you kept me breathing. Laura sat at her desk and opened the incident reports that were waiting, staff complaints about protocol violations that needed director review. She read them with the same measured attention she'd given to every patient, every wound, every soldier who needed her back when the world thought she was dead or forgotten or never existed at all. Outside her window, Sacred Heart's ER saved lives in the fluorescent-lit dark. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. The heart monitors beeped their constant count. The stretcher wheels squeaked down corridors where people were being brought back from the edge of not existing anymore. And downstairs, at the night security desk, Dr. Richard Ashford watched another hour tick past on a clock that wasn't moving fast enough. His hands were steady, but not in the way they used to be. That steadiness was gone. This was just the steadiness of a man who had nothing left to lose and nowhere left to go. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Laura's phone buzzed. A text from Reeves, now restored to full active duty and working as a military medical liaison, night shift. Some things don't change. She smiled, something she rarely did in front of anyone else now, and typed back, some things shouldn't. She set the phone down and returned to the reports. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And for the first time in 7 years, she was doing it with her real name, her real rank, her real story standing beside her like a witness who could finally speak. If you've been underestimated, if you survived something that was supposed to end you, please like this video and tell us your story in the comments. And subscribe because tomorrow, we're bringing you another story about power, truth, and what happens when institutions finally have to answer for what they've done.